Hi guys, I hope you're doing really well. My name is Sarah and welcome to What the Horror, the channel where we talk about horror movies old and new. Also, welcome to a new episode of Truly Horror, the series where we talk about the true stories, the true events, and true crimes surrounding certain horror movies. The behind-the-scenes stuff that is often stranger and scarier than the movies themselves. Today, we are taking a look at the true events and inspirations behind the 2008 movie The Strangers. The Strangers is a psychological home invasion horror film that was written and directed by Brian Bertino. It stars Liv Tyler and Scott Speedman and currently has a rating of 48% on Rotten Tomatoes. James Hoyt and his partner Kristen McKay go to a remote house to spend some quality time with each other, but in the wee hours of the morning, a knock at the door changes their lives. While The Strangers is not always the most highly regarded of horror movies, it does still have a large fan base and is credited for being genuinely unsettling in moments. It even made it to number 95 on Shudder's recent 101 Scariest Horror Movie Moments of All Time list, because of that one haunting line delivered by one of the masked strangers. Home invasion horror isn't for everyone, granted. We all have that one aspect of horror that sends shivers down our spines and makes us want to sleep with the light on, and perhaps home invasion just doesn't do that for you. However, I think we can all agree that the reality of three strangers breaking into our home, into our safe space, and tormenting us is pretty horrifying. It's a horror event or circumstance that we might struggle to distance ourselves from by saying it's not real, it's only a movie. Because it could be real, it's something that could happen to us. And the fact is, The Strangers is actually based on not one, but two real-life events and true crimes, and that's what we're going to talk about today. As always, we'll look at the movie's version of events first, and then we'll get into the true events behind the film. And because we'll be covering the movie, spoilers will be included, so just bear that in mind if you haven't seen it yet. So, The Strangers opens with a very Texas Chainsaw Massacre-esque voice claiming that
what you are about to see is inspired by true events.
And that according to the FBI, there are an estimated 1.4 million violent crimes in America each year. We then see footage of two young boys coming across a vandalised car and a house with its front door wide open. Over the top of these images is the sound of a 911 call made by one of the young boys to the police, explaining that they found bodies and that there is blood all over the walls, that there is just blood everywhere. This is a little teaser for the audience of the events to come. On the night of February the 11th, 2005, Kristen McKay and James Hoyt leave a friend's wedding reception and return to the Hoyt family summer home. Tensions are running high between the two as we discover that Kristen has just rejected James's proposal of marriage. And although there's still affection there, they're uncomfortable around each other in the summer house that awkwardly James has decorated romantically with champagne and rose petals. At 4 a.m. in the morning, there's a knock at the door, and when they answer it, they see a young blonde woman standing in the dark. The woman asks,
"Is Tamara here?"
No.
But when James says there's no one of that name there, the woman leaves. James leaves Kristen alone as he goes out for a drive and to get her some more cigarettes. And Kristen waits in the house for his return, and while she's waiting, she hears another knock at the door. Kristen very smartly doesn't open the door but asks who's there, only to be met with the same question as before. Is Tamara there? She reminds the woman that she's already asked here, and then she locks the door. A third knock comes moments later, and feeling spooked, she calls James and asks him to return to the house. She asks him to stay on the phone with her until he gets back, but their call is cut short and the line goes dead. Kristen heads to get a drink of water, and while she's stood in the kitchen, we can see a masked man quietly steps out of the shadows behind her. Kristen is unaware of the man being there, and he just watches her as she drinks. And when she finally turns around, he's gone. We now know that whoever it is knocking on the door and messing with the couple is quite capable of getting into the house. But Kristen hears a fourth knock. She tries the landline again, which is still dead, and then her panic rises as she notices a smoke alarm has moved from where she had left it, and her charging mobile phone has gone. Kristen then hears a noise coming from the back outside, and when she opens the curtains to check what it is, she sees the masked man that was watching her before staring back at her. She runs to the front of the house but is surrounded by loud knocking on doors, and then the front door opens a little and Kristen sees a doll-like mask peeping through. Kristen runs and hides into the bedroom, where there is loud banging and crashing coming from inside the house. The noises stop and James walks into the bedroom. Kristen tries to explain to James what is happening, and he believes her, but perhaps doesn't quite understand the seriousness of the situation. But when he finds his car vandalised and his mobile phone, which he had left in the car, inside of the house with the battery removed, he quickly catches up. Kristen and James try to leave in his car, but one of the masked strangers rear-ends them with a pickup truck, so they return to the house where they arm themselves with James's dad's shotgun. After one of the strangers tries to axe down the front door, James and Kristen hold up in the bedroom. Earlier that night, James had called his friend Mike to come and get him from the house after the rejected proposal. Mike finally arrives, and after his car is attacked and he sees the damage to the front door of the house, he thinks that something is clearly wrong and he goes into the house to investigate. But poor Mike ends up being shot by James, who mistook him for one of the intruders. And what's so tragic about Mike's situation is that even if James hadn't shot him, he would have been killed by the masked man who was following him with an axe. James remembers that there is a radio in the barn out back and he tries to get to it, but is knocked unconscious by the masked man before he can. Hearing the commotion, Kristen then tries to get to the radio in the barn herself, but before she can get through to anyone, the doll-faced stranger attacks the radio with an axe. When Kristen returns to the house yet again, she is tormented by the strangers until the masked man knocks her unconscious. As the sun comes up, James and Kristen find themselves tied to chairs with rope in the living room. Kristen asks the masked strangers why are they doing this to them, and the blonde woman simply replies,
"Because you were home."
The three strangers then remove their masks and take it in turns to stab James and Kristen. I mean, you could argue that had they not removed their masks, then James and Kristen wouldn't have known who they were, and so couldn't have identified them if they reported them. So, by removing their masks, these strangers are sending a very clear message. They want to kill the couple, and they want the couple to know who is killing them. The movie then comes back around to the young boys from the opening. The strangers drive past them in their truck, but first take one of the boys' religious leaflets. The two boys come across the summer house and find Mike, James and Kristen inside, but when one of the boys reaches out to Kristen, she wakes up and screams. So, first, let's just address that while the movie opens stating that the film is inspired by real events, and I am here to also say that it is in fact based on real life events, the actual story in The Strangers and the characters of James and Kristen are all fictional. There wasn't a real couple called James and Kristen who were murdered by three masked strangers. Instead, the young couple merely acts as a stand-in for those that experience something similar. In the beginning of the episode, I said that the story of The Strangers is based on and inspired by two true life events. Those of an incident that actually happened to the writer Brian Bertino himself and the Tate murders committed by the Manson family in the 1960s. Well, some speculate that it's also based on a third event, that of the Keddie cabin murders that happened in 1981. The Keddie cabin murders are an unsolved quadruple homicide that happened over the night of the 11th and 12th of April 1981. The murders took place at the Keddie Resort in California in house number 28, where victims Sue Sharp, John Sharp and Dana Wingate were all killed. All three had been tied with medical tapes and electrical cords, and their bodies were found in the living room. The fourth victim, Tina Sharp, was at first a missing persons case, believed to have been abducted by the killer or killers, but her remains were then found in 1984. Despite ongoing investigations into the case, no one has been arrested for these murders. There were rumours of it being ritualistically motivated or being linked to drug trafficking, and a couple of serial killers who were active at the time were ruled out as being possible. But in April 2018, DNA evidence was recovered from a piece of tape from the crime scene, and apparently they were able to match it to a known living suspect, but what came of that, I'm not sure. You can't deny, though, that there are certain similarities between The Strangers and the Keddie cabin murders, such as being bound by cord and the murders taking place in an isolated home. But you have to remember the link between them is just speculation based on these similarities. The writer Brian Bertino has never confirmed this theory or mentioned them as an actual inspiration. One event that was an inspiration, though, and one I find incredibly sinister, is that of the real-life incident that Brian Bertino experienced himself when he was young. Bertino explained that as a kid he lived in a house on a street in the middle of nowhere, and one night while his parents were out, somebody knocked on their front door and his little sister answered it. At the door, there were people asking for someone who didn't live at the house. And Bertino said that they later found out that these people were knocking on doors in the local area, and if no one was home, they would then break into the house. A pretty creepy story, especially for them to experience as young children, and then perhaps understand the significance of it as an adult. I love how Bertino flipped this already nasty event on its head, and instead of having the people knocking, targeting the homes where no one's in, they target the home where someone is in. While I was reading into The Strangers and browsing webpage after webpage, I came across something that quoted film scholar Kevin Wetmore's take on the movie and the violence within it, and how it is a reflection of its contemporary culture. Wetmore wrote, quote, "Death is random in post 9/11 horror, the result of being in the wrong place at the wrong time, as the cliche goes. Unlike the 80s slasher horror, for example, where engaging in negative behaviour such as drinking, drugs and premarital sex are often forerunners to being killed by the killer, here death is random and unrelated to one's behaviour." End quote. This observation of the random act of violence and its being unrelated to the character's choices and behaviours perfectly syncs up with the final true life event that inspired Brian Bertino when writing the film's script. That of the true crimes of the Manson family, in particular the true crime book called Helter, Skelter, which covers the Tate LaBianca murders committed by the Manson family, and which Bertino read when he was younger. When speaking of his inspiration for the film, Bertino said, quote, "I was thinking about the Tate murders and realising that these detailed descriptions had painted a story of what it was like in the house with the victims. But none of the victims knew about the Manson family or why it was happening to them. So I got really fascinated with telling the victim's tale, and not filling it in with an FBI profile, and not filling it in with finding out that somebody's grandmother beat them and now they want to kill everybody. You read obituaries every day where someone is killed for a random reason. Yes, we may eventually find out why, but sometimes they don't." End quote. I think we've all probably heard of Charles Manson, and perhaps even most of you have heard of the Helter Skelter murders. If not by that name, then at least you may have heard of the murders of the actress Sharon Tate. True crime is at an all-high in popularity, and cult leader Charles Manson is one of the biggest known names and cases. The Tate murders were also the subject of one of my personal favourite movies, Quentin Tarantino's Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. However, Tarantino, while loosely portraying the story, decided to go in a what-if direction and turns the tables on the members of the Manson family who committed the murders, led by Charles Tex Watson, delivering us a different version of events. Manson spent a lot of his life in and out of prison during the 1950s and 1960s. He committed multiple criminal acts and was an all-round nasty piece of work. In 1968, Charles began to gain followers, which grew into what we now know as the Manson family. You see, while Manson was illiterate, he possessed a higher than average IQ of 109, and he was able to charm and persuade people to his will very easily. According to one family member, Charles would also keep his followers doped up on LSD and, quote, try to reprogram their minds to totally submit to his will. Charles would take LSD with his members, but would always take a lower dose so that he was able to keep his wits about him while the others became compliant. When the cult family consisted of approximately 50 people, they decided to settle in California and set up home in Spahn Ranch, which used to be used as a movie and TV show set during the height of the westerns, like 50s, early 60s. What you may not know about Charles Manson is that he was also an aspiring musician with dreams of being as big as the Beatles. And while he lived in California, he befriended the drummer of the Beach Boys, Dennis Wilson, and he also approached their music producer, Terry Melcher, for an audition. But when Melcher visited Manson at his home, he very quickly just wanted to get the hell out of there, both because of believing there was no musical talent, but also just because of the state of the home. It made him feel very uncomfortable. It's believed that Manson was angry that Melcher hadn't signed him up to a record deal, and now saw Melcher and the house that he rented as a symbol of what Manson believed was society rejecting him. Charles Manson also believed that there were subliminal messages contained within songs by the Beatles, more specifically in a song from their White album called Helter Skelter. According to Paul McCartney, one of the Fab Four and the writer of the song, he was, quote, using the symbol of a helter-skelter as a ride from the top to the bottom, the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, and this was the fall, the demise, end quote. But to Manson, the song was saying rise, kill, and according to Liz Wheel, a former federal prosecutor, legal analyst and author, Manson convinced his cult members that the music of the Beatles, specifically the song Helter Skelter, contained subliminal messages to commit violence. Wheel also believes that in his anger, Manson used the lyrics in the Beatles' White Album to help form his plan to create a race war in LA. She said, quote, "The race war would end with LA in shambles, and only he, Charles Manson, and his followers, who would be waiting in the desert for the exact right time to appear, would come in and save the city. Manson would be the leader of LA after the blacks had risen up, helter skelter, and all would be nirvana." End quote. Brianna Fox, assistant criminology professor at the University of South Florida, says, quote, "The fact that Manson was feeling rejected and isolated from society, that lyric interpretations were popular at the time, and that Manson needed a new project to keep the followers in his family occupied and on his side, likely led to his fascination with the Beatles' lyrics and the use of Helter Skelter to motivate the murders committed by his family." End quote. And that is exactly what he did. Wanting to kickstart his plans, Charles Manson instructed his second-in-command, Tex Watson, to take Susan Atkins, Linda Kasabian, and Patricia Krenwinkel to 150 Cielo Drive in Benedict Canyon, LA, and, quote, "totally destroy everyone in it and do it as gruesome as you can," end quote. That was it. That was all the instruction the members of the Manson family had, and they followed them. The reason Manson had chosen that particular address is because that was the house that Terry Melcher had been renting. But unfortunately, Melcher no longer lived there. Instead, a certain director of Rosemary's Baby and his actress wife Sharon Tate were now living there. On the night of the 8th of August 1969, Sharon Tate, who was 8.5 months pregnant at the time, was at the Cielo Drive house hosting a little get-together with her friend and former boyfriend Jay Sebring, a friend of her husband's, Wojciech Frykowski, and his girlfriend Abigail Folger. Tate's husband wasn't at the address with them as he was working on a film in Europe at the time. Sharon Tate often had gatherings at her house, and there were apparently some other potential guests who were supposed to go, but didn't for one reason or another. The music producer, Quincy Jones, was a friend of Jay Sebring's and had planned on joining them, but didn't in the end. And one of my favourite actors, Steve McQueen, had also been invited by Jay Sebring, to which McQueen had said he'd be there. However, fortunately for McQueen, he ended up being a no-show thanks to a young and beautiful blonde he was seeing at the time. When he invited her to Tate's house with him, she told him she had a better idea for just the two of them. Watson and the three women arrived at the address just after midnight, and Watson then climbed a telephone pole and cut the phone lines for the house. While entering the grounds of the house, the group was spotted by a teenager named Stephen Parent, who had been visiting the caretaker of the address. Watson killed the boy and they hid his body and the car. Linda Kasabian kept watch outside while the other three entered the house and attacked the people inside. I'm not going to go into detail here, but if you do want to know the details, there is plenty of information online. But Sharon Tate and her guests were tormented and chased. Some were bound in the living room and killed, and others were killed while they were trying to escape the house. Manson had told the group to, quote, "leave a sign, something witchy," end quote. So they wrote the name Pig on the front door using Tate's blood. The following night, on the 10th of August 1969, Charles Manson, Leslie Van Houten and Clem Krogan and the four family members who attacked the Tate house went for a drive and ended up at 3301 Waverly Drive, the home of supermarket executive Leno LaBianca and his wife Rosemary. Manson was apparently displeased with the way the previous night's attacks had gone, and he wanted them to kill the LaBiancas. Manson approached the house and returned a while later, stating that he had tied the couple up. Manson returned to the house with Tex Watson, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten. The LaBiancas weren't in fact already tied up, but the group very quickly did wake them and move them into the living room, where they then tied them with lamp cords. Again, I won't go into the details of the actual murders because they're just so mean and violent that I know YouTube won't like it, but all of the details are online. The LaBiancas were killed brutally, and again using the victim's blood, the members of the cult wrote messages. They wrote "Rise" and "Death to Pigs" on the walls, and they wrote "Helter Skelter" on the fridge door. So those are the true events that inspired the story of the Strangers, and honestly, once you know this, the links and similarities between them are so obvious. The knock at his door as a kid where people were asking for someone who doesn't live there. The messages written on the wall by the attackers. Okay, so it's a mixture of blood and lipstick in the Stranger movies, but still very similar, and you have the couple bound and attacked in the living room, a common thread through the true stories. And finally, you also have the fact that the victims in the film and in the real life events didn't know why this was happening to them, why they were being attacked. When the Manson family attacked the people at Sharon Tate's house, Frykowski asked Tex Watson who he was and what he was doing there, and Watson replied, "I am the devil and I'm here to do the devil's business." This response echoes when Kristen asks the strangers why they are doing this to them, and the stranger replies, "Because you were home." I hope you guys liked this episode. As always, don't forget to let me know any other films you'd like me to cover, but in the meantime, thank you as always for stopping by. I really do appreciate it. Take care of yourselves, and I will talk to you in the next episode. Bye, guys.